So I just thought, well, what is essential? And really, I crossed out postmodernism for your homework, but I do want you to have some sense of what it is. So we'll start with talking about that. And this relates to last week's, which the topic was relativism. Now, what is relativism? Somebody?
Anybody can say pretty much anything,
Right.
Belief in subjective truth, not
All,
objective truth.
right. So it's a denial of objectivity when it comes to truth. So all truth is really subjective and relative to the individual. There are different types of relativism. We talked about that. One of the types is postmodernism, which is really more of a cultural relativism, meaning, I'll just read what I have. So it's an emerging form of cultural relativism where reality, truth, and value is totally relative to your group. So it's really more of like a group relativism. Reality, truth, and value are creations of a community that share the same language and culture. What is real for one group is not necessarily real for the other group. And so here's kind of the logic of it. So it's important to have an understanding. When I say objectivity, it means your openness to take things and look at it without bias, right? So there are two kinds of objectivity. There's psychological objectivity, and there is rational objectivity. So psychological objectivity is the complete absence of bias. It's really only good when you haven't formed an opinion. So for example, I am psychologically objective when it comes to South American soccer teams. I am completely open to people's opinions because I have not formed an opinion about that at all, right? I am not psychologically objective when it comes to Christianity. I'm not. I'm emotionally attached. I'm emotionally involved. I would be really devastated if my whole worldview were to crumble and be shattered, right? So I don't have psychological objectivity about that, and nobody has psychological objectivity about anything they really care about or have formed an opinion about. You're emotionally involved. But then there's rational objectivity, which that's the ability to tell the difference between a good argument and a bad argument. So just because I may be psychologically biased, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm rationally biased, that I lack rational objectivity. And so the postmodernist argument is that since nobody is psychologically objective, therefore nobody is rationally objective. And so with that, rationality and argumentation are no longer valid forms of inquiry. And so reason is dethroned and is no longer a test for truth. And so you could say that this is self-refuting because it assumes that the postmodernist is rationally objective when they make this statement. And it uses reason to deny reason. So it's suicide, self-refuting. So postmodernists tend to rely on rhetoric as a form of persuasion. So colorful illustrations, ways of literacy, different types of, storytelling is a big deal with postmodernists. Dichotomous thinking is rejected, so opposites, really are not a big deal because everything's culturally relative. There are no meta-narratives, no story that is true for everybody. And it has a new definition of tolerance. So it's wrong to judge others people's beliefs. So it's wrong to say someone's false, in other words. So this kind of creates this whole modern redefinition of tolerance. And this is common amongst people, particularly when you talk about religion. This is why religion is kind of that taboo topic when you get into discussions with people. Now, the real kind of traditional definition of tolerance is that you love and put up with somebody whose views you judge to be wrong or immoral. Right? That's what it means to tolerate. I don't like what you're doing, but I'm going to love you and be with you and accept you for who you are, regardless of what you do. You know, I'm going to tolerate you. Now, the new view of tolerance is you accept what other people believe, and it is intolerant to judge a belief that is different than yours, and that exclusivity, meaning your belief is the only belief, that causes disharmony and is therefore intolerant. And so the problem with this view is it's self-refuting, because judging someone's belief as intolerant is a judgment of that person's belief. So it again falls the suicide tactic. It makes no sense of the word tolerance, because what is there to tolerate if nobody's wrong? Right? Think about that. It makes no sense of the word tolerance, because what are you tolerating if everybody's, you know, you're not saying anybody's wrong. It doesn't really make sense. And it's immoral because it silences our ability to protest evil and produces isolated, indifferent people who don't care about each other. I got that from J.P. Moreland, I think. A lot of those notes on postmodernism. So here's where it influences the church, and this is more, you know, it's not, it's culture. Culture influences the church in ways we don't realize, and so bad ideas have a way of just infecting people without, you know, like I said last time, people pick up ideas like dogs pick up fleas, and they form things that they don't know where they got them. But postmodernism is embedded in the culture, and the culture affects the church, and so these ideas cause problems in the church. And so youth are being raised up in a culture where it's offensive to speak in terms of objective truth claims. So they focus on reaching people in ways that are socially acceptable. So you'll find there's a huge, you know, influence on social justice, huge influence on rhetorical expression, art, music, storytelling. These are the kind of things that are not, you know, culturally offensive, right? And so there's nothing wrong with those things. It's just that's the, you know, you'll find there's a huge shift in some churches to really just kind of emphasizing those things. You know, the things where the culture is not going to be offended by. And so, you know, one big thing, if you want to see postmodernism, watch the Rob Bell Numa videos. I couldn't really even explain it with words better than just go and watch them. They're really, it just really demonstrates what postmodernism looks like in the church. I really couldn't think of a better example. Rob Bell. Don't watch them. They're not true. They're not good. They're bad. But if you want to understand how postmodernism is influencing the church, watch the Numa videos by Rob Bell. It's very artful, very storytelling, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of, you know, you'll if you watch them, you'll understand what I mean. And you'll really have a better understanding of what I mean by postmodernism, because that is essentially postmodernism in the church. So with postmodernism in the church, reason is no longer considered as a valid form of persuasion. So apologetics is anathema. You don't tell people they're wrong. You don't prove your ideas to be true, because you know that's just not that's. You know, that would be postmodernism's negative effect on the church. The other issue is postmodern hermeneutics. You guys know what hermeneutics is, right? Most of you took a class. Yeah, everybody? You haven't taken it? So hermeneutics is basically how you study a text, how you gather information from a text and retrieve the meaning of a text. And so postmodern hermeneutics would look at a text very differently. And so they deconstruct a text by completely disregarding the author and what he intended when he wrote what he did. Because remember, there are no objective truths. It's really how I see it, or how my culture perceives this. So postmodernists approach a text like a free-floating chunk of literature that is open for individual interpretation, because everybody has their own interpretations. And so when it comes to the Bible, the focus is no longer on theology and learning what did Paul intend, what was the cultural background, what was the context in which he wrote it. Was he in prison? What's affecting, those are the kind of things that if you're studying hermeneutics you would be looking at to get a better understanding for the meaning. What's the context? What's the syntax? You look at the Greek to try to figure if there's extra meaning in the Greek that maybe isn't really in the English, because all of those things will highlight what Paul really intended. And that if you're really studying theology, you care about that. Whereas if you're studying for personal application, you don't really, those things don't matter. You're just reading the Bible for your own personal, experience, right? And so those type of people just don't study theology. They never do. And what ends up happening is the Bible turns into something like an Ouija board, where you can pop open the Bible and read a text independent of its context. And, I open up the Bible and it says, "Grace be unto you," and I'm dating Grace. So that means God is telling me I should marry Grace, because grace be unto you, right? And, that's how people, you laugh, but seriously, that's how people read the Bible. I remember a church, somebody read a passage about, there's some verse in Isaiah saying, "Go to the coastlands." And so they felt like there was their own private interpretation of they were supposed to go to the coast. And so people they read the Bible this way, and it's devoid of the context, and you could make the Bible say magically whatever you want. And it's basically relativism. You've relativized the text because it no longer matters. Context, syntax, all that stuff are irrelevant. The Bible is just a magic Ouija board that tells you different things if you open it and pray about it, and anyways. So religious superstition is then baptized in spiritual language, and so what ends up happening is the emphasis. So this affects the whole emphasis of what you emphasize in church. Because if you are emphasizing, if you guys are emphasizing objective truth, you're going to be looking at more deeply at theology. You're going to be looking more deeply, again, at the context, the syntax, the Greek language. You're going to be all of the things that go into how you discover. You're not creating meaning, you're discovering meaning that was intended by the author. Does that make sense? But once you kind of throw that out, the emphasis is no longer on truth but on experience. And so you'll find that this is like a plague actually in the church, where there's just an unhealthy emphasis on the experiential, devoid of the foundational truths that would ground somebody in objective reality, and it leads to religious superstition. And basically, people like this will embrace Christianity as irrational and celebrate the fact that it's not rational. And it ends up resulting in crazy charismatic stuff, and believe me, I've seen it all. I've seen a lot of it, and I think it's a horrible witness for Christ, because once you embrace Christianity as irrational, you've really kind of taken truth away, and our God is the God of truth, and it's just really a major mistake. And so it's a heresy that breeds heresy. And so I thought that was important enough for us to visit before we go into our new notes, which is now the next page. Our new notes is on the meaning and the existential problem of atheism. So meaning and the existential problem of atheism. So that's kind of our topic for today. So we're going to talk about meaning. Why is life meaningful? Is your life meaningful? What makes it meaningful? People often ask, well, what's the purpose of life? What are the foundational things for there even to be possible for there to be a purpose to life? And what are the epistemic foundations? What do I need to have, or what is the ontological grounding for meaning and purpose in life? So fundamental to us as human beings. And if you don't have meaning, that creates what I call an existential problem, experiential problem to life, your ability to live life out. Going to have to review the whole difference between subjective and objective. Would somebody, like to explain what's subjective truth? What's a subjective truth claim? What does it look like? Let's raise our hands. I'm a junior high kid. Junior high teacher, I always make people raise their hands because inevitably, if I pause, more hands go up. So what is a subjective truth claim?
A subjective truth claim is more of an opinion. It's a truth claim based on a subject, like a person's own opinion on how something is.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. No, that's right. There's nothing wrong with what he said. It's totally good. The truth claim is directed towards the subject. So that when I make the nature of the claim is not really talking about the object, but really more the subject. Even if the words may sound like it's the object. For example, if I say mint chocolate chip ice cream is the best ice cream in the world, it sounds like I'm really talking about the ice cream, but in reality, the truth claim is pointed at me and my experience with the ice cream. What I'm really saying is I like it the best. So then objective truth claims. Can somebody, Chris?
Objective truth is something that is. It's something that's going to stay the same for everybody, everywhere. It doesn't matter what somebody thinks about it.
Right. It's true independent of people's beliefs, and the arrow is directed at the object. It's about the object, not the subject, the thing that is subject to the object. We used last week, mint chocolate chip ice cream can be used as medicine to cure diabetes. No, obviously that's not true. If you have diabetes, you should not be eating mint chocolate chip ice cream. But the nature of the claim is an objective claim. It's, I'm making a statement that's either true or false, and it's about the ability of the ice cream to perform things for diabetes, right? And objective truths would still be true even if nobody in the world believed them. I noticed that the way I worded it, pretty much everybody in their slides I worded it wrong, and you guys all copied what I wrote, and so it was worded wrong, so I changed that. So that was my fault. Anyways, so I did change it. Okay, so defining meaning and purpose. So meaning and purpose, so foundational to life, right? So meaning has to do with significance of something. Basically, significance is probably the best thing. What gives it significance? Something is either meaningful or really it doesn't have, it's kind of insignificant. It's either significant or insignificant, right? So that's what meaning is. Purpose has to do with an end goal, a reason for it, right? This cup has purpose. Its end goal is to hold the water that I will drink, right? There's an end goal for its existence, and that's for holding water for human consumption. So that's meaning and purpose. They're very similar, but there's different semantics. There's definitely a difference between meaning and purpose. But they really kind of run the same vein. They run in the same vein. Values and duties. So values have to do with the worth of something. So something is good or bad, right? It doesn't necessarily, it's not the same thing as a duty. For example, if I said it would be good for you, Cameron, to grow up and become a doctor. I'm making a moral value statement about good, right? You could help people, you could make a lot of money and serve your church. You might be able to go on missions trips, right? And you'd be able to help poor people, in third world countries and share the gospel. There's all sorts of things you could do if you became a doctor. So I think it would be good if you became a doctor. Now, do you have a duty to become a doctor? No. I'm just making a statement about value, right? Duties are something different because it has to do with the responsibility of something, right? It is your duty to watch the videos for the week prior to coming to class. That's your duty, right? It's your moral duty because we're here, and you're submitted to this church and you're supposed to do what you're supposed to do. And so, it's your duty, right? It's my duty to prepare a lesson, right? It also has to do with, all sorts of things. Anytime we sin, we violate a duty that we've done, or we were supposed to do. So anyways, again, both, just like meaning and purpose, values and duties are interrelated. And really all four of them are interrelated. They're all kind of similar things, but they all kind of have their separate semantical category. Okay? But this is what we're going to be talking about. Because I'm going to just tell you right off the bat, I'm going to make the claim that you really can't have objective meaning, purpose, values, or duties without God. And that affects majorly your outlook on life, your perspective on what you're doing. What does it matter? What does it matter that I wake up in the morning? Right? Why don't I just give up? Does what I do even matter? Even if I do it to the best of my abilities, does it matter? We would say no. It doesn't without God. God is the only basis for any of these things. So, jumping ahead of myself, but that's where I'm going. That's kind of the whole purpose of this lecture. So for your homework, your first homework was to define meaning and purpose. Don't worry about values and duties. I mean, you can always do that. Cameron, by the way, you did a really good job on your slides. Just want to highlight, he not only did he include everything, he broke it up. I kind of want to almost show you. It's like you did a really good job, and he didn't even have to. All you guys did a good job, but for whatever reason, Cameron, your slides looked really good. And so. But yeah, so this is, again, you can add that in there, but what I really want you to do is meaning and purpose. We will talk more on values and duties next week. We'll have a whole day on values and duties and the whole moral argument. So next slide is define nihilism and existentialism. So nihilism is really a philosophy of despair. Basically states that life is without objective meaning or purpose, that there are no innate duties, that nothing of any true and there's nothing of any true value. Life is essentially hopelessly worthless. Different forms of existentialism. You have nihilistic existentialism that recognizes that we all have all we have is the now. So, okay, have you guys ever heard of the word existentialism? You guys kind of, did anybody kind of want to give a jab at what it means? What is it's a hard one. Existentialism. Anybody? So it's an important word because it comes up in conversations. People will talk and just assume that you know what it means. And so, to carry on a good conversation, it's good to have these vocabulary terms down and know what people are talking about. So existentialism, at the root of existentialism is the word exist. All right? And existentialism is basically emphasizing the now. Right? The now. We live in the now. That is where value is. It's in the now. So a nihilistic existentialist is somebody who recognizes that he's an nihilistic existentialism really would be the logical conclusion of atheism. I have had friends that I've had debates about this, never converted them to Christianity, but converted them to nihilistic existentialists, which is the logical conclusion for their beliefs. That all they have is the now. There's no future. There's no hope. They're not accomplishing anything ultimately, no matter how well they live. They have their experience and they want to live life to the fullest, just because all they have is the now. But ultimately, even that is without meaning, because there is no meaning, no objective meaning. And so one could create meaning in this life, but in the end it is ultimately absurd and meaningless. So they embrace the absurdity of life. And because one of the things that R.C. Sproul says in the videos, we're not automatons. We're not robots. He says we're thinking, breathing, feeling people. And that to say that what we do doesn't matter strikes at something very hard, the heart of our soul. And so there's really an existential problem with embracing this fully, and most people are not willing to go there. And so if anything, it's good to show them that if you don't believe in God, this is the alternative. And so we'll talk more. Existentialism, the philosophy which focuses on the now, our present existence, live in the moment. Sorry, I'm skipping ahead. Okay, so in the myth of Sisyphus, a guy by the name, by the way, some of the most greatest pieces of literature ever produced by humanity has to do with this topic. Some of the greatest pieces of literature, like the Brothers Karamazov, The Wall, there are several. A lot of focus has been on this subject of meaning, and some of the most colorful illustrations of this come from the existentialists themselves. Albert Camus compares. Was an existentialist, and he wrote a short story called "The Myth of Sisyphus." Where basically, he talks about this Greek character, this ancient mythological god who caused a bunch of ruckus, didn't care about the authorities, was ultimately sentenced to what the gods considered to be the most miserable punishment ever, and that was to take a big rock and charge it up a mountain, only to let the rock fall back down the mountain, go down there and get it up and bring it back up again, and to do this over and over and over for all eternity. And so Albert Camus tries to, in fact, I brought it up. I just wanted to read it before I yeah, it's on your notes. So Albert Camus, okay, I already said that. I'll just read this last part. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds, this is right at the end, his conclusion. One always finds one's burden again, but Sisyphus teaches us the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. The universe, henceforth, without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor fertile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. Kind of strange, right? I think it is. But they're trying to embrace the now and understand and just embrace the absurdity of life, that it is hopeless and meaningless, but we have now, and so we're going to live for the now. Right? When you talk to somebody who says they're an existentialist, that's essentially what they mean. Now, I don't know if I have this in my notes. There is Christian existentialism. There was a guy, oh man, what's his name? Kierkegaard, good. Kierkegaard, it was a Christian philosopher who emphasized the now and living and experiencing Christ in an experiential form of Christianity that values the relationship with God, which is a totally different deal, right? So that would be the form of Christian existentialism. So Kierkegaard. We'll go to Solomon for sure. So really, what Solomon does in the book of Ecclesiastes, the entire book is basically a contrast between life without God and life with God. So life under the sun, which is without God, and life under heaven. And if you don't, once you read, if you understand this lecture and then you go and reread Ecclesiastes, look, I'm getting goosebumps. You will find it just explodes with meaning in a way that you would never have thought when you read it the first time. His goal was to set out and find meaning under the sun. So he set out to do anything and everything he could within his power. And he found that the conclusion of the philosopher was vanity of vanities, all is vanity. He said it's like grasping at the wind. So have you ever tried to grasp the wind? Do you accomplish much at trying to capture the wind? Right? You grasp it. Do you get it when you grab it? It's a hopeless, purposeless, feels like you're doing something, but you're really ultimately not when it's blowing in your face and you're clutching at it. Interesting illustration, but it really kind of highlights this whole idea of the meaninglessness. Yeah. So, all right. So you have a slide, okay, and guys, you might want to put a little check mark by this one where it says explain the argument that says life cannot have objective meaning or purpose without God. So this is going to require like the next 2 pages for you to fully, or really 4 pages. And I'm just going to let you pick what you think is, unlike the videos before where I've pretty much like spelled out this slide, you're going to say this, next slide, this, you're going to say this. I want you to just pick from my notes what might be necessary to make this argument. Okay? So put a little star to remind yourself that at this point, you don't just write what I have directly underneath the slide. You're going to have to write. You're going to have to pick through stuff to really do a good job. And maybe you'll explain it differently than I will. It's actually the next 2 pages and a little paragraph on the top. So, okay. So this is basically what you would call a transcendental argument. A transcendental argument. A transcendental argument isn't like conclusion, therefore God exists. Rather, a transcendental argument says, look at this thing here. In order for this thing to be meaningful, maybe it isn't meaningful, but if it was meaningful, you would need God. Right? And you can do the moral argument that way too. And usually when people think of the transcendental argument, they're talking about logic. Like, in order for logic to exist, you would need God. That's actually, there's a lot of debate about that one. Some people think that one moves a little bit too fast because the laws of logic could, in theory, exist as necessary beings, metaphysically necessary beings. But that's I don't want to confuse you with all that. But basically, a transcendental argument says this. It asks the questions, what must be in order for what is to be what it is? That's what, it's not an argument that ends in the conclusion, therefore God exists, or therefore this is true. It's just saying, if something is, what must be in order for it to be? What are the necessary foundations for the thing? So, and basically, the argument says that there's no middle ground between nihilism and theism. Now, what is nihilism again?
It's like the strongest form of atheism?
It's the strongest form of atheism. Basically, there's no meaning, no purpose, no values, no duties, just there's just now. And so, so basically, if we get to the video, hopefully we will. I'm trying to move a lot faster with these notes. R.C. Sproul, in his video, he has a little chalkboard, and he writes on one side nihilism, and then draws another side and writes theism, and basically says that there is basically, throughout history, there have been all sorts of different philosophies, and they all fit somewhere between these two extremes. And he basically says that there really is no legitimate middle ground, that any attempt to have a middle ground is borrowing from theism illegitimately. And that the logical consequence is that either you believe in God and embrace an objective meaning to your existence, or you reject God's existence and recognize the utter meaninglessness and absurdity of your existence. And that most people who reject God are not willing to go that far, but it is the rational conclusion. And it, if anything, makes the subject of God a very significant topic. Because what's more significant than the significance of your existence? Your very being. So you take that away, there's, like I said, there's an existential problem. It makes the now certainly a whole lot less worth living, I would say. The existentialists try to argue that we just embrace the absurdity and we live life in the now and be brave enough to accept that absurdity and live life to the fullest despite the fact that it ultimately means nothing. Sometimes a good pause lets the thought settle. Okay. So, what makes this, okay, so I already talked about this. Yeah. So, this is kind of an example. It could be like a taking the roof off type thing. You're showing the logical, you're adopting atheism and driving it into a tree. You're showing that the conclusions are absurd, because how absurd would a life devoid of meaning actually be? And few people are willing to embrace that. So it's like taking the roof. It's one of those taking the roof off tactic things, or reductio ad absurdum. You're reducing it to the absurdity, and it like I said before, it highlights the significance of God's question. All my notes are If I go ahead of my notes, I end up saying what my notes already said. Yeah. Okay. So arguing transcendentness, here's again, what must be in order for what is to be what it is. What are the necessary transcendent assumptions? So these are what you would call presuppositional. So people who engage in, remember at the beginning when I talked about there being different kinds of apologetics? And one of the philosophies in apologetics, excuse me, is presuppositional apologetics. Presuppositional apologists argue this way, using transcendental arguments. Again, what I don't really like about presuppositional apologists is they deny the classical arguments, but I still like what they do. I think that they've got some good stuff, and you can really learn a lot from them. I think that the classical arguments are still very valid and really useful. They would just say they're epistemically backwards, but that's a whole nother debate. But this is how presuppositional apologetics works. Again, there's something called the ancient triad of truth, goodness, and beauty. These are inescapable realities that we deal with every day. The question is are they objective? Is truth objective? Is goodness objective? Is beauty objective? If we say no, then the question is, why do they matter so much? If we say yes, then what is the basis for their objectivity? Now, again, when it says truth, with regard to truth, the question is why are there these objective rules that govern conscious activity? Why, logic is really this weird thing. Why is there logic? Why is it that we can say that there are rules that govern what you can say truthfully and what you can't say truthfully? Ways that you can make propositions and ways that would be invalid propositions. It's like a computer. Why does it exist? Well, this is kind of more of like a, I don't know that I'm like super like into this argument, but some people really are. And if you want to see a video, remember I told you the Doug Powell videos that at the beginning, one of the first videos we watched was that apologetics thing. I showed you his YouTube channel, and he's got one on what he calls the transcendental argument. And usually when people say the transcendental argument, they're talking about logic and what is the basis for logic. And they would say that you would need God in order for logic to exist. I'm not so sold on that argument because I could conceive how logic could exist as a metaphysically necessary being because of the impossibility of the contrary, and that's the justification for using logic, is that it's impossible to deny it without affirming it, which what we talked about last week. So, but just know that people do argue that way, and presuppositional apologists are big on that too. And they would call logic human reason, and I don't know that I would necessarily consider it human reason. I would consider it logic to be divine reason, that it's actually God. God is the foundation for logic. He is truth, and so it stems from his very being, logic. The Logos, yes. We'll talk about Logos tonight. Okay. Anyways, goodness. So if the good is more than just a personal opinion, then what grounds its objectivity? What makes it objective? Rather than just your personal opinion. In order to make, anytime you make, we'll talk about this is all tomorrow. We'll talk about goodness. But in order to make a value judgment, you have to assume that there's some kind of objective standard. Otherwise, you can't be judging somebody for not meeting the standard. And if there is a standard, what makes it objective? So if you're confused, don't worry. We'll spend a whole day on it tomorrow. That's the goodness one. Beauty, or Monday. Next Monday. Oh, okay. Yeah, sorry. Okay, and then beauty. So there's a whole thing, a good argument that could be made about objectivity in beauty. Is beauty merely within the eye of the beholder? What makes a painting a masterpiece? I see a beautiful painting right here, right? It's aesthetically pleasing, right? Isn't it? It's got the Rome. Look at it says empire on it. Look at it's got this beautiful like picture of Africa right here. Like, isn't this beautiful? Isn't it? Right? Isn't this like the Mona Lisa beautiful?
What?
Right? Isn't it?
No.
No, it's not, right? So, but how can we make how can we make judgments about beauty? We do make objective statements about beauty, but the question is how? What would be the standard for beauty that causes us to recognize one thing as being more beautiful than another thing? You would need to have a reason for it to be objective, rather than just your own personal experience. So anyways, throw that in there because it is related to this. So meaning is just, this argument for meaning runs the exact same way. If you want to say something is objectively meaningful, you have to have some basis for it being objectively meaningful, right? You can't just say it arbitrarily. There's got to be a basis for it being objectively true for the thing itself. The. Does the word the have meaning by itself? But what, isn't the a pronoun? Aren't pronouns important for the human language? But by itself, would the have any meaning? It's just a particular. What about the letter T? You can't have the without T. Is T meaningful? What about H? H, it's great, but my last name is H. What? H, isn't it a meaningful thing? By itself, would it be meaningful? No. So H and T are given meaning in that they are found in the letter the, right? And other places, right? But if they didn't have a higher order of meaning, that would just be T, right? And the wouldn't really have a higher meaning. It wouldn't have really, it would just be this random word, the, right? What's the? The is a pronoun that we use in human language quite frequently, right? And so it's a part of a greater order of thing, namely human language. But human language, well, okay, so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Let's move on to my notes. 2. Percent, plus, addition, equals, rounding, fractions. My 7th graders, I kill them with fractions. Fractions are so tough for 7th, especially special ed 7th grade. It's tough. It's really tough. It's like the hardest thing I teach, fractions. Negatives, averages, variable, sum, product, 6, greater than, less than, etc. Could I just go on with these random things? Individually by themselves, do they have meaning? Does a plus sign by itself have meaning? Plus doesn't mean anything unless there's numbers in front and back of it, right? It's an operation, right? So what is the coherent thing that gives all of those in particular things meaning? Mathematics, right? So what about this particular thing? Mathematics. Is that meaningful? Why? Well, by itself is it meaningful? Math is meaningful, but is it just meaningful by itself? No. Why is it meaningful? Because it affects, commerce. It affects all sorts of different things. Well, what about, mathematics is a portion of a greater level of meaning, or a greater tier of particular things. There's mathematics, there's business, there's political science, language arts, physical science, philosophy, history, art, etc. Each one of those, are they meaningful by themselves? No, right? So they're just particular things, right? But collectively, they have a higher order of meaning in life, and that's education, right? Education. But education by itself, independent of anything else, is that meaningful? No. Education is a part of a higher tier of particular things. You've got education, you've got family, you've got health, you've got work, there's leisure, community, etc., right? Now, each one of those has a higher particular thing, and that's you. Those things matter to you. They're part of your life. They're part of your daily experience, right? That's what gives those things meaning. But what about you? Do you have meaning independent of anything else? Well, if there was nothing else, if it was just you. No. You're part of the planet Earth, right? You're part of the United States. United States is part of, well, you're part of Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is part of California. California is part of the United States. United States is part of the world. Does the world have meaning? So, do you understand where I'm? Do you understand like how, like where I'm getting at, where I'm going? Each thing as a particular thing has no meaning unless there is a universe. So there's this thing about the universals and particulars. A particular is only meaningful if it's in the context of a universal. But each universal is a particular thing by itself. So unless there is this ultimate higher universal that is the ultimate universal, you are just a particular thing. Everything under it is just a particular thing, meaningless. So there's this problem of the one and the many. Now, Greek philosophers wrestled with this. This is all throughout the history of philosophy, trying to reconcile the one and the many. And you know, they had a term. There was a, what was his name? There's a term that goes all the way back to the beginning of philosophy to describe this unifier. You know what it was? The Logos. God came much later in Greek philosophy. But the term that was used at this unifying, I'm getting goosebumps again, the Logos. It's the thing that unifies the one and the many. And it's just very interesting that John chose to use that term to describe Jesus Christ in John chapter 1. He said, "In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God." Verse 14 said, "And the Logos became flesh and dwelt among us." That was a term loaded with philosophical baggage. And the great scandal in Greek philosophy was to assume that the Logos was a person rather than an abstract concept. So this is the kind of stuff that gets my hair standing up on the back of my neck. I don't know about you, but okay. So that was all about meaning. We're going to move on to purpose. So purpose has to do with an end goal. Remember? Meaning has to do with significance. So without God, there is ultimately no significance. And you know, you would use that argument, the problem of the one and the many. So purpose is kind of a different argument. So again, no middle ground with respect to purpose. You've got theism, nihilism, no middle ground. You following me? So if I assume that there is no God, then at the beginning, life did not begin for a reason. Because purpose is like, this cup existed for the purpose of holding water. If God exists, the world was created for the purpose of His pleasure. If there is no God, it began with no purpose. It was an accident. Accidents, or what do I have in my notes? It was undirected. It was the product of chance. And chance is really the opposite of purpose. So the Big Bang and then evolution, the whole theory of evolution is based upon the premise that unguided natural forces, chance and the combination of chance and physical necessity brought about the first living cell and went from the first cell to from the goo through the zoo to you, and it was an undirected, purposeless thing. It wasn't like it was done for a reason, right? No, you can't have a purpose without a purposer, essentially, what I'm saying. So, not only did it begin with no purpose, it will end with no purpose. And we live in a dying universe. That's a fact. We live in an expanding universe. We live in a closed system where the amount of usable energy is running down. And that's called the second law of thermodynamics. It's fundamental to physics. It's the reason why you can't drop a basketball and have it keep bouncing. Ultimately, the amount of, in order to have work, energy is lost to the ambient environment. It's the reason a car could never run 100% efficiently. So the universe itself is, yes, I'll take my coffee, please. The universe itself is dying of a heat death, or the amount of usable energy is finite. Think of it like a car that's running. If you find a car and it's running, what do you know? It works. But what do you know about how long it's been running? It hasn't been running for forever, right? And so the universe is the same way. It's like a car that's using up a finite amount of energy. That implies that it hasn't been running for forever and that eventually it's going to run out. Right? That's like a scientific fact. But what does that mean? It means that the fate of the universe is that it's destined to end. Right? So think about all of the accomplishments of man, all of the philanthropy that was done, all of the peace efforts. Say you solve the problem in the Middle East. Say you become a doctor and find the cure to cancer. Say you fill in the blank. All of the accomplishments of man come to nothing because the universe will die and we will be like a forgotten dream. It's like we're shuffling chairs on the deck of the Titanic and it's sinking. So, no purpose at the beginning, no purpose at the end. So, what basis is there for purpose in the middle? There is none. And so, if you emphasize that, there's almost like a deep-seated sadness when you really think about it. And I remember there was a time when I always grew up in a Christian family. I grew up saying Bible verses. You know, I told you about that time I took acid and, you know, died and went to hell. I didn't become a Christian right away, but I studied stuff, and the first thing I wanted to know was evolution. And my teacher, science teacher, convinced me it was true, and so eventually I stopped believing in God, and I felt this meaninglessness. No longer, even though I was not following the Lord, my actions didn't matter. There wasn't a God who loved me. There's no purpose to life. There's no meaning at all. And I remember that being a very, very, very deep-seated existential problem for me, and how it affected my ability to live. So people at this point would make an objection, and the first objection is, can't you create your own purpose? So you start talking like this, that's what they're going to say. Yes, you can create a subjective purpose. That would be true for the subject, but you can't create objective purpose that is true for the object. And just because something is purposeful to you doesn't mean it's purposeful at all. What's the basis for it being purposeful? What's the basis for you being purposeful at all? There is none. So, creating meaning is really no more than deceiving yourself. Ultimately, that's what it really means. So, next objection. There are, and this one comes with the explanation points. There are things in my life that are meaningful to me, and that matters, right? But why are the things that are meaningful to you meaningful at all? Where do you get your sense of self-worth from? You're just a little speck of dust next to a star in a universe that's dying. Where do you get your sense of self-worth from? This is one of those things when you start to bring up, people get mad at you. Because it really touches a nerve. So I got to move faster because I want to watch the video. Okay. So objection. Can't we at least agree that there is meaning in survival and being happy? Think about that. Is there meaning in survival? In being happy? Well, the problem is survival is a hopeless endeavor because we live in a dying universe, right? The universe doesn't care whether you're happy or miserable. And again, you can't justify, this is the main thing, you can't justify that what matters to you or the entire human race matters at all. So next thing, this is going to be a slide that you're going to have to do, is to show that all attempts to find meaning and purpose without God are arbitrary. Do you guys know what the word arbitrary means? Now that I teach junior high, I'm discovering that people get lost by my vocabulary, especially in special ed. So I now double check big words. Arbitrary. What does arbitrary mean? What? Absurd, that's could be a synonym, yeah. Baseless, without foundation, without justification. It's just it'd be like, let's say you went to court and the judge didn't care about the answer, you just flipped the coin. Guilty, right? A baseless decision, right? And so your goal on the slide is to show that attempts to find purpose without God are arbitrary. So you could just give an example, like the forgotten dream. So assuming atheism, when the universe dies, not if, but when the universe dies, the earth and all the life that it has ever existed will be like a forgotten dream. Have you ever had a forgotten dream? How do you know if you forgot it? did what happened in that dream matter? Interesting thought, right? A forgotten dream. If God doesn't exist, this is a forgotten dream. The doomed astronaut. Here's another example. You could just, do this or think of one of your own. The forgotten dream is definitely my favorite one. The doomed astronaut. A doomed astronaut stuck alone in an escape pod that's flying into deep space, hurled toward a boiling star. His actions inside the pod, or can his actions inside the pod possibly have any meaning? Nothing he does can possibly affect his eventual death. His actions, thoughts, and beliefs are meaningless. So too is the human race, as we hurl uncontrollably toward a certain death. Then the other one I like to use is shuffling checks on the deck of the Without God, we are like the busboy shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. Just colorful illustrations. Maybe you can think of your own. If you think of a good one, I might put it in my notes. So purposeless with meaning. This is a summary. No purpose at the beginning, no purpose at the end, no purpose in the middle, therefore no purpose at all. Life without God is purposeless, without reason or intent, and therefore meaningless, without significance. So, if you do believe in God, what's the so that's the negative, not believing in God, but think of the meaning that comes from believing in God. With God, you have meaning and purpose, significance. Not only do you exist for God's pleasure, but He actually made you special in that you're actually made in His image. And that makes you more valuable than any animal or anything on this planet. When I teach junior high, I always start with some type of ground rules, right? Because if you don't tell them what the rules are, then later on when you try to bring up new rules, it doesn't go so well. One of the ground rules is that people are valuable. Doesn't matter if you don't like them, doesn't matter if they smell, doesn't matter if they're ugly, right? Doesn't matter if they haven't taken a shower in a month, which you get that in special ed. It's unfortunately true. There's no, it's a problem. I keep deodorant in my classroom, because kids are junior high, they don't really realize or get it that they need to use deodorant. But anyways, people are valuable. I start that off, as fundamental to all of your interactions within my classroom. You're valuable. You shouldn't make fun of other people because people are valuable. It doesn't matter anything about the circumstances. You treat people with dignity because they're valuable. That's the basis for treating them with dignity. Well, what I'm not allowed to say is that the basis for their dignity is that they're made in God's image. Although sometimes I try to sneak it in wherever I can. But especially if they have questions. Anyways. Yeah, so that is so significant. And not only are you made in the image of God, but guess what? Your life is eternal. So the decisions you make now will affect all eternity, for forever. The stuff you do now, you have the ability to seal up treasures in heaven where moth and rust do not destroy. Right? How cool is that? Right? I get goosebumps thinking about that, because when you see the contrary and you really analyze the antithesis, how beautiful is it that life is meaningful, that you matter, your life matters? It's heavy stuff, heavy stuff. Again, no middle ground. So I talked a little bit about the book of Ecclesiastes. It's really written like as if it was a modern piece of existential literature. You're going to have to quote something from the book of Ecclesiastes. I recommend this one, or you can check out Ecclesiastes 2. Ecclesiastes 1, verse 3, or 13 through 14 says, "And I set in my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. This burdensome task has given me to the sons of men, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping at the wind." Vanity of vanities. So the next thing it says, to explain Pascal's wager. Have you guys ever heard of Pascal's wager? Anybody? Yeah, Pascal's triangle. I've been teaching actually, you guys ever heard of Pascal's triangle in math? Right. So this is a geeky math thing. So yeah. So basically, you've got 1, and then 1, 2. No. 1, 1, 1. 1, 1, 1. And this would be 1, 2, 2, 1. And this would be 1, 2, 4, 2, 1. This would be 1, 3, 6, 6, 3, 1. Well, every number underneath is the sum of the numbers on top of it. But there are all sorts of crazy patterns with this thing. You could get into it and show there's like triangles and all sorts of different mathematical concepts that go into this thing. And so this year our math department decided to start with a whole unit, and one of the things was, the whole thing is like showing that math is about finding patterns. And Pascal came up with this thing. He was really a fascinating guy. He only lived to like 30 years old. He invented the first calculator, and his computer, he basically started the concept of a computer language. So all of computers, he's really the grandfather of computer software. He's also had a very dramatic conversion. And he is a philosopher. So if you take a 101 philosophy class, you'll learn about Pascal. He wrote a Christian apologetics book that never was finished, called Panseis. Doug Groothuis wrote a whole book on Panseis that explains, the argumentation of Pascal. Famous philosopher throughout history. He did more things I just can't think of. I mean, he invented like toothache medicine, all sorts of crazy stuff, all before the age of 30. He was like, 10 years old. He was studying Euclid geometry and stuff. Child prodigy, really interesting. Anyways, so he has something that's famous called the Pascal's wager. And this is one of the most hated arguments of all by all atheists. They hate this argument. They think it's so stupid. But it still is a powerful argument. Basically, the wager is that in the absence of evidence, both for or against, one should choose to assume that God exists, because this allows us to live happy and consistently, and that we stand to lose nothing if we believe in God, but it turns out to be false. But we stand to lose everything, including very meaning itself, if God ends up being true and we have denied his existence. And so how does this prove God? The answer is it doesn't. It doesn't need to. It's what you would consider a presuppositional argument. And if meaning and purpose are to be objective, then you would really need God. It's analysis. It's looking at the cost-benefit analysis. Yes, it is. But even more fundamentally to that, it's about life and the very meaning of life. If you choose to deny God, you are really robbing yourself from a life that has meaning. And so I have a little Rabbi Zacharias thing. It's going to start off with kind of, this clip is actually from the video from last week. Remember I said that those two videos are like some of the best sermons I've ever heard in my life. So if you missed those, please go back and watch them. I would appreciate seeing them show up on your sign thing, but make sure next week that you do the one for week 4 first. But you really are missing out if you don't listen to these, both of them really. So.
You pull the threads together in your life, and when you stand before Him someday, every thread will make sense, and you will find the hope that needeth not be ashamed, because you're covered by the grace of one who walked to Calvary for you and rose again from the dead for you to offer you hope and eternal life. Tell me what atheism has to offer as hope. It's in you. And if you look inside, that's pretty meager. No law, no hope, no meaning. And ultimately, you deny God, and if you find out that He actually exists, there is no recovery at that point. You know, Pascal said this, and I'll close with this. Should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false. Should a man be in error in supposing the Christian religion to be true, he could not be a loser by mistake. But how irreparable is his loss, and how inexpressible his danger, who should err in supposing it to be false. This wager of Pascal has been the most misunderstood thing that I have ever heard interpreted. Pascal is not here betting and thinking he's got the better bet. Pascal is saying this: if all you have to offer in life outside of God is some kind of fulfillment and personal existential satisfaction, I get that in God. But what I get in God is more than that. So if your test is some kind of a temporary fulfillment of your 70 years and 10, I have found it in my spiritual belief. But I have found more than that. I found the truth, and I found an eternal destiny. So your test I have already met. My test you have not met. That's what he's saying. No, I've written a series of books called The Great Conversation.
So, Pascal, do a slide on that. Okay, so you could construct some positive arguments for the existence of God rather than this just being presuppositional. Instead of it being, in order for this to exist, what must be for that to exist, that would be a transcendental argument. A positive argument would end in the conclusion, therefore you should believe in God, right? Or therefore God does exist. But really it's more, therefore you should believe in God. C.S. Lewis has a really interesting argument, and I almost need to read this twice for it to really kind of sink in. It says, a man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. And there's like a ... If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. There's that pause to let it sink in. I'll do it again. A man feels wet when he falls into water because man is not a water animal. A fish would not feel wet. If the whole universe has no meaning, we should never have found out that it has no meaning. Just as if there were no light in the universe, and therefore no creatures with eyes, we should never know it was dark. Dark would be a word without meaning. We discern meaninglessness because meaning exists. If meaning exists, then God exists. So that would not be a presuppositional argument, that would be a positive argument. Do you guys see the difference between a presuppositional argument and an argument that thrusts forth a conclusion, therefore God exists? Presuppositional arguments are more reserved, but they have less of a burden of proof. Does that make sense? And you'll see that next week when we talk about the moral argument, because you can formulate the moral argument as a presuppositional argument, or you could formulate it as a positive argument for the existence of God. And so this kind of helps you understand the difference between classical versus presuppositional apologetics. A classical apologist would never use it that, or a presuppositional apologist would never use an argument that sounds like that. They would always form it in the presuppositional way. All right, so for practical purposes, one should adopt theism. So this is an argument not that therefore God exists, but more therefore you ought to believe in God. So one, we should always adopt a worldview in which there's at least a potential for meaning and worth. Two, and that would be probably the most controversial premise. Two, atheism provides no possibility for meaning. Three, theism provides a possibility for meaning. Four, therefore one should adopt a theistic worldview. And you're going to have trouble with that first one. An existentialist would take issue with that first premise. I think the first premise just is obvious because of this existential dilemma that we face. Now, to highlight this, in Dr. Craig's book, Reasonable Faith, he's got this, it's either Reasonable Faith or it's On Guard. I can't remember which one I got this quote from. I think it's Reasonable Faith, where he says, okay, so this, I'll just read the quote, and I'm terrible at reading long quotes, so bear with me. In a remarkable address to the American Academy for the Advancement of Science in 1991, Dr. L.D. Rue, confronted with the predicament of modern man, boldly advocated that we deceive ourselves by means of some noble lie into thinking that we and the universe still have value, claiming that, quote, the lessons of the past 2 centuries is that intellectual and moral relativism is profoundly the case. Dr. Rue muses that the consequences of such a realization, that one's quest for personal wholeness or self-fulfillment and the quest for social coherence become independent from one another. So again, I'll read that again. So Rue muses that the consequence of such a realization is that one's quest for personal wholement or personal self-fulfillment and the quest for social coherence, everybody getting along, become independent from one another. This is because on the view of relativism, the search for self-fulfillment becomes radically privatized. Each person chooses his own set of values and meaning. There is no final objective reading on the world or the self. There is no universal vocabulary for integrating cosmology and orality. If we are to avoid, so he separates 2 options. If we were to avoid the madhouse option, where self-fulfillment is pursued regardless of social coherence, or the totalitarian option, where social coherence is imposed at the expense of personal wholeness, then we have no choice but to embrace the noble lie that will inspire us to live beyond selfish interests and so achieve social coherence. The noble lie is one that deceives us, tricks us, and compels us beyond self-interest, beyond ego, beyond family, nation, and race. It is a lie because it tells us that the universe is infused with value, which is a great fiction, because it makes a claim to universal truth when there is none, and because it tells me not to live for self-interest, which is evidently false, but without such lies we cannot live. Interesting quote. Interesting quote, and it kind of bolsters the whole premise one of that argument. So, but why? So the next question is, but why believe a noble lie when one can just adopt theism, which at least has the potential for being true, right? We need meaning for life, not just in order to be happy, but in order to function. So instead of creating a farcical meaning for life in order to trick ourselves, we should be much more rational to adopt theism. I actually got through my notes. First time. Yes. Much less notes. It's 7:30, but we go till 8:10, so we're golden. Why is my thing kind of... Any questions before I throw on this video? Any thoughts? Comments? Jonas?
Can you repeat that with the Asian triad with the beauty? Because for me, beauty is very relevant.
Okay.
Because when you look at different cultures, they have different ideals of beauty.
Right. Different expressions of beauty. But would there not be like a common thread? You know, I mean, I know that this is a tough one, but trust me, if you take a logic class, there's actually a logic to, there'll be if you get a logic book, like a textbook on logic, there will be a whole chapter on aesthetic value, and that there is a reason behind ascribing aesthetic value. I can't tell you more than to just, I remember when I took a logic class, there was a whole chapter on that. Okay, I can also look at, the example of, I could draw a little stick figure, and, look at this, like, pretty, like, look at how, isn't that pretty? Look at, that's you, Jonas. Got a big old smile. Like, look at, he's holding his little Bible, right? Look at that. Isn't that pretty? Look at, he's got I even had little teeth to make it better, right? Okay, well, I'll put in some fingers. What kind of shoes you wearing? Well, okay, there they are, shoes. Okay, this is as beautiful. This is as beautiful as the Sistine Chapel. So what I'm using reductio ad absurdum.
I kind of get it that it's like that you have the sins of something being not really beautiful.
If there was no basis, we could not make judgments about fine art. We could not recognize the difference between a kid going ding 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 on a piano and Beethoven or Bach, right? Kid's making music, he's having fun, do 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 do, right? Clonk clonk clonk, maybe he's got a little beat, dun 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 dun, right? And then right. So as hard as it is to really stay firmly, this is beautiful and this is not, with specific instances. We recognize beauty when we see it. And we recognize certain things as more beautiful than other things, right? It's a hard concept.
Just having the existence of seeing something that is not beautiful already confirms that you have to have it.
Right. In order to say something,
some kind of
you
beauty.
answered your own question probably better than I did. You did. So I'll have to remember that one. Yes.
If you look at the last page, you have this long quote.
Yes.
There is no universal vocabulary for integrating cosmology and orality. Should that be morality?
No, it's orality. I actually looked it up because I thought there was a typo. Orality. Google it. Orality is a thought and verbal expression in societies where the technologies of literacy are unfamiliar to most of the population. So the study of orality is allied with the study of oral tradition, I guess. I don't know. That's the first definition that came up. Okay. That's the benefit of having a computer right up. Boink. Okay, so we're going to watch this video. We've got just enough time, so I'm going to go ahead and start it. Yes. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave my little computer thingy right here. All right, you guys ready?
As we continue now with our study of defending our faith, the science of apologetics, you will recall that in our last session, I looked briefly at the moral argument for the existence of God that was set forth by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. And I mentioned that he approached this question from a practical consideration, coming to the conclusion that we must live as if there were a God. Kant, from a rational, scientific, theoretical perspective, was agnostic, saying through our normal avenues of research and investigation, we can't know that there is a God. Yet, for practical purposes, we must assume that there is a God in order for life to be meaningful, for society to be possible, and we looked at how he constructed that practical argument from his awareness of this categorical imperative, this moral imperative that is shared by people around the world. Now, at the end of that lecture, I mentioned that not everybody in the philosophical realm agreed with Kant's conclusion that we must live as if there is a God. Some were what they might be called as hardcore cynics or skeptics, and they said just because the options to the existence of God are grim, that is no reason to believe in God. That would be like falling into an Alice in Wonderland scenario where you take a deep breath and close your eyes and wish with all of your might that life is meaningful, life is significant, that somebody's home up there who's going to make justice take place in the final analysis, and have that as a ground for faith. Well, let me say this before we continue, that in the history of philosophy and of theoretical thought, I think that we could certainly isolate and individuate at least 1,000 different distinctive philosophies, philosophical theories, philosophical movements, and so on. But there is a gamut that these philosophical systems run. They tend to find themselves somewhere between two poles or two polar extremes. On this side, we have what I call full-bodied theism. And on this side of this pole would be nihilism. And nihilism is not only that there is no God, but it also goes from that conclusion to the idea that there is no meaning, no significance, no sense to human existence. And all other philosophies find themselves situated somewhere along this continuum, in between these two poles. Now, if you look at historic Christianity, and Judaism for that matter, if you go to the Old Testament scriptures, you see that the wisdom literature of the Old Testament wrestled with these two antithetical positions, chiefly in the book of Ecclesiastes, where two different perspectives are explored. There is life as it is experienced under the sun, and life as it is experienced under heaven. Now, if I could translate that and indeed transfer it into modern categories, you go back to Kant and Kant's criticism of the distinction between his noumenal world, the realm of God, and the phenomenal world, the realm where we observe things in the scientific exploration of our senses. And he saw this wall that existed between this world and the transcendent world. Now, if we took Kant's theory and then moved it backwards into the Old Testament, you could say that the distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world would be the distinction between life under heaven, which is the noumenal realm, or life under the sun, which is the phenomenal realm. And what was the crux of the conflict that the Qoheleth is speaking to in the book of Ecclesiastes is this, that life under the sun ends in the final analysis if there is no God, if it is not under heaven, but if life is restricted strictly to this side, under the sun, to the phenomenal realm, then the conclusion that the philosopher of that day came to was found in the phrase, vanity of vanity, all is vanity. Now, the expression vanity of vanity is an expression of the superlative. Take it over into the New Testament. When Christ is exalted by the New Testament scriptures and he is seen as the king, he is called what? The King of Kings, the Lord of Lords. That's a Hebraic way to say the supreme king, the supreme Lord, because he's King of the King, Lord of the Lords. And that's the same thought that's in this idea of vanity. Vanity of vanities. It's an extreme position to conclude that everything is vanity. Now, what is meant by the term vanity here is not pride that is found in somebody we say is vain and narcissistic because they sit at the vanity in their makeup room and apply all of their makeup and cosmetics because they are so vain. That's not the significance or meaning of vanity here. Here the term vanity is a synonym for the word futility. So what the author of Ecclesiastes is saying, from the vantage point of the phenomenal, without reference to God, if there is no God, then, of course, in the final analysis, what we encounter is futility of futility. Everything that we do is futile. We are locked in a cycle, a vicious circle that has no beginning and no purpose, no teleology, no significant end. The sun rises, the sun sets, then as Hemingway described it, the sun also rises again, and it sets, and it's going nowhere. That's the basic underlying philosophy of nihilism. You know, that the poor player struts his lyre on the stage and is heard no more. It's the tale, told by the idiot. It is full of sound and fury. It signifies thus nihil. The nihil. Nothing. Nada. Meaninglessness. Now there are few philosophers who are willing to go to that extreme. Most philosophers in history who have rejected full-bodied theism have sought to develop a worldview or a philosophical system that exists somewhere between these two poles. And so, in a sense, anywhere you find yourself on this continuum, you are borrowing capital from one or the other. I've always said this about humanism, that in the final analysis, humanism, which is so popular, is extremely naive. because the humanist tells us there is no God, and that our origins come from nothing, accidentally, from a meaningless event, and that our lives are moving inexorably towards annihilation. So that the two poles of human existence, these two poles are meaninglessness at our origin and meaninglessness at our destiny, and yet the humanist fights for human rights and human dignities in between these two poles. Or I keep saying to the humanist, you have both feet planted in midair, and as Francis Schaeffer used to say, you're on a roller coaster without brakes, because you want to have meaning between the two poles of meaninglessness, and in the final analysis, you are resting on sentiment. You just don't have the courage to go where your atheism drives you, which is to full nihilism. And so that's just one example of how systems in between here will borrow capital. There's no basis for believing in human dignity if we're cosmic accidents. But humanists fight for human dignity, and so they try to sneak in that which they are borrowing from Christianity, from Judeo-Christianity, even though they categorically reject the source of human dignity. That's the point I'm saying. So that there are compromise positions between here. Now, I'm trying to paint here with a broad brush and simplify this with a minimum distortion. But this is what Kant saw in his moral argument. This is what Dostoevsky saw, where he said, if there is no one home here, then the Bible is right with this thesis. Remember these words that we find in the New Testament: without Christ, without hope. When he wrote to the Corinthians, the Apostle Paul said, if Christ is not raised, and if all those who have died have perished, then we are of all people the most to be pitied. And if you don't like that we are believers, don't be mad at us, don't be hostile towards us. Feel sorry for us. Just think of all the fun we're missing that you're having and enjoying, and we're walking around, naively naively looking at God and believing in God and trusting in God and all that, when Christ is a dead man. And if I'm devoting my life to a dead man, what a waste of my energy and of my life. And if you disagree with my convictions, don't be mad at me. Pity me is what Paul is saying, because we are pitiable. The idea here is, really, if you have no basis for establishing confidence in the God of the universe, you have no foundation for hope whatsoever. That you must come to hopelessness. Well, Kant didn't want to go to hopelessness. Kant said the whole fiber of our humanity, every bone in our body screams to us from the time we're first awake in consciousness that our lives do count, that our lives have meaning, and that the labor that we are engaged in, the sweat, blood, and tears that pour out from our passion, that those passions have meaning. And if we thought that they didn't, we would want to end that labor and end our misery. Well, you see, that's where philosophy's gone. Albert Camus, 20th century existential philosopher, came to this conclusion, that the only serious question left for philosophers to explore is the question of suicide. And what Camus is saying, simply, is if you awaken to the reality that there is no God, that there are no absolutes, then you understand that there's no ultimate meaning. You might like it for a season. It might sound good when you hear that school's out, no more teachers, sassy looks, and so on, because we have a vacation from the God of the Bible who says he's going to hold us accountable for everything that we do. And when we find out that that God doesn't exist, we leap into the air and click our heels together and say, I'm free. Thank God I'm free. I can do whatever I want. I can do my own thing. And that sounds terrific until you turn Get over and look at the price tag, and that's what Camus said. If, for example, if you are not accountable, ultimately, it's simple to understand that ultimately you don't count. Life doesn't count. And if you really think about that consistently, then you understand why Camus says the only serious question left is suicide. That's why Jean-Paul Sartre, in a tiny little book called Nausea, he titled the book Nausea because that was his final comment about the human condition, and he defined man as a useless passion. That's a loaded concept for Sartre because Sartre noticed that we as human beings are not automatons. We're not robots. We're not bumps on a log. We are living, breathing, thinking, choosing, caring human beings. That human life is marked by care. Human life is marked by passion. Now, what if all your passion, everything that you care about, is worthless? What if everything that you care about, everything that you love, is meaningless? Then your passions are futile. This is what Sartre said. That's what you are, a useless passion. All your cares come to nothing. See, that's what Nietzsche was driving at when he explored his concept of nihilism, following Kant in the 19th century. In other words, what the existential philosophers, the atheistic existential philosophers, the nihilists, were saying was this: if we can't know that God exists, it's not enough to build our faith by crossing our fingers and hoping that somebody's home up there. If the evidence is to the contrary, if it's really true that life has emerged fortuitously out of the slime, then we have to have the moral courage, the intellectual courage to face the grim finality of the results and stare it in the face and say, okay, you're right. I came out of the slime, I'm going to the slime, I'm a grown-up germ sitting on one cog of one wheel of a vast cosmic machine that is running down and is destined to annihilation. That's where I am, and I'm going to face it, and I'm not going to run to religion as an escapist form. Realize the driving passion in contemporary culture is escapism. Escapism through hedonism. And the whole philosophy of hedonism is that you find meaning through pleasure. Maximize your pleasure, minimize your pain. It's the philosophy of Timothy Leary. Turn on, tune in, drop out. Let's put daisies down the barrels of rifles, and let's just go on a trip and go to La La Land, where I don't have to think anymore. It's an escapist form from pain, from having to consider what the popular music is telling us, what the film industry is telling us, what the high priests of science are telling us. You are a beast in human clothing with no ultimate significance. And this message is being beat into kids' ears over and over and over again. And so we drown it out, the sound of their music, or with the drugs, or with other forms of substance abuse, as a means of escape. Now, what Nietzsche and the skeptics would say is that's not the only drug. The supreme drug to escape nihilism, according to 19th century atheism, was the opium of religion. If you're a Christian, I'm convinced that you haven't been a Christian for 2 weeks until somebody has already said to you, the only reason you're a Christian is that you're using your faith as a crutch. And that crutch is something that you use is to help you function, to help you remain mobile when in fact you're crippled. That's what a crutch is for. And the charge is that we use religion as a psychological crutch because we can't bear the message that we're getting from all sides. So we turn to religion as the ultimate form of escape, the ultimate drug, the ultimate crutch. What Marx referred to as the opium of the masses, as a narcotic to dull our senses, to minimize pain. In other words, that religious people are just one brand of hedonists who seek their pleasure in escaping from the real world of futile passions, futile labor of death. Now, again, in the 19th century, when we study the voices of the atheists of that period, they really weren't working that hard to disprove the existence of God. Rather, their opening assumption was there is no God. And the biggest problem that Marx and Feuerbach, Nietzsche, Sigmund Freud, and other titanic thinkers, skeptics of the 19th century, that the question they were trying to answer was this: since there is no God, why is it that human beings are incurably religious? Why is it that man could be defined not only as Homo sapiens, but we could more properly define mankind as Homo religiosus, man, the religious person? Because wherever we go, throughout the world, we find the vast majority of people engaged in some kind of religious activity. And from a Christian point, that religion may be complete idolatry, but nevertheless, it is still religion. And so the most common and frequent answer that came from people like Marx and Feuerbach and Freud and so on was that the phenomenon that answers the universality of religion is psychological fear. That is, that the main reason why people believe in God is because they're afraid of the consequences if there is no God. The main reason we create God in our own image, said Feuerbach, is because we understand that without God, we are doomed. We are in a hopeless situation. We are indeed a useless passion, and we can't bear the grimness of nihilism. So to escape nihilism, we leapfrog over all of these intermediate options and affirm the existence of God as our bromide, as our narcotic, to dull our senses from the pain. So that the number one argument against theism in the 19th century was that theism is a result of the psychological need of naive people. On our next session, I'm going to examine that from a Christian perspective and see whether the shoe may be on the other foot or the crutch may in fact be for the other leg.
These lessons are like soap operas. Like the next one makes you want to, he ends it so you want to listen to the next one. So we have a couple extra minutes, and I do want to, there was just a section from this particular thing. With the way these things work, you can only, can I go up to like 10 minutes?
This is really going to happen. as indescribable, as unbelievable as it is, this is really going to happen unless God intervenes first.
He's talking about the end of
So
the
not
universe.
only is the life of each individual person doomed, the entire human race, the whole edifice and accomplishment of human civilization is doomed.
This is like a teaser.
Like
for the end.
prisoners condemned to death, we await our unavoidable execution. There is no escape. There is no hope. And what is the consequence of this? It means that life itself becomes absurd. It means that the life that we do have is without ultimate significance, value, or purpose. Let's look at each one of these in turn. First, no ultimate meaning. If each individual difference, better the lot of the human race marooned on a barren horror of modern man. Because he ends in nothing, he is nothing. But it's important to see that it's not just immortality. There is no good, nothing more like a piece of modern existence. Then there is a breath of empty space. Has it not become colder with his eyes to understand the gravity of the alternatives?
So really, this whole idea of nihilism really started with the philosopher Nietzsche. That's something. Oh, look at me talking without my microphone. So this whole idea of nihilism really began with the philosopher Nietzsche. So just listen to this. Nietzsche, really it was about the Enlightenment age that really atheism blew up, right? You have Kant and Hume. Hume being the mega skeptic, Kant the guy who deconstructed a lot of the classical arguments for theism. This brought about a lot of skepticism. This was coupled with a lot of scientific discoveries, understanding the natural world from a scientific perspective. There was a huge faith in science's ability to provide answers. And you have Charles Darwin coming about with the naturalistic explanation for the origin of life. Christianity is kind of backing off as secularism fills in the void. And Nietzsche sees all this. He's an atheist, and he is the one who really recognizes the consequences of this problem. And again, like I said, some of the most beautiful things and one of the most interesting pieces of literature come from this wrestling over the meaning of life itself. And throughout, some of the most classic pieces of literature ever written were written on this topic. And so I just listen to this. This is from Nietzsche.
Before us. For if God exists, then there is hope for man.
It might take a minute.
But if God does not exist, then all we are left with is despair. As one writer has aptly put it, if God is dead, then man is dead too. Unfortunately, most people don't realize this fact. They continue on as though nothing had changed. I'm reminded of the story told by the 19th century atheist philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche of a madman who, in the early morning hours, burst into the marketplace, lantern in hand, crying, "I seek God! I seek God!" Since many of those standing about did not believe in God, he provoked much laughter. "Did God get lost?" they yelled. "Or is he hiding? Or maybe he's gone on a voyage or emigrated," and thus they yelled and laughed. And then, writes Nietzsche, the madman turned in their midst and pierced them with his eyes. "Whither is God?" he cried. "I shall tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how have we done this? How were we able to drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What did we do when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually? Backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down left? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night and more night coming on all the while? Must not lanterns be lit in the morning? Do we not hear anything yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? God is dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves? The crowd stared at the madman in astonishment and silence. And at last he dashed his lantern to the ground. I have come too early, he said. This tremendous event is yet on its way. It has not yet reached the ears of men. People did not yet comprehend the consequences of the death of God. But Nietzsche predicted that someday people would understand the implications of atheism, and this realization would usher in an age of nihilism, that is to say, the destruction of all meaning and value in life. Most people still do not reflect upon the consequences of atheism, and so, like the crowd in Nietzsche's marketplace, go unknowingly on their way. But when we realize, as did Nietzsche, what atheism implies, then his question presses hard upon us. How shall we, the murderers of all murderers, comfort ourselves?
So I'll end with that. Goosebumps, right? We get goosebumps with this kind of stuff. Father God, we just come to you humbly and just thankful that we know you. We're thankful for the value that you add to our lives, not just to our lives, but to life itself. And God, we are nothing without you. We're hopeless, worthless beings without you. But with you, we're precious and valuable in your sight. So valuable that you sent your Son to die for our sins. God, and we get to spend eternity with you. God, I just pray that you would help us to live like Kierkegaard said, to live in the moment, to live life to its fullest, enjoying you, storing up treasures in heaven where moth and dust do not destroy, moth and rust and dust. And God, I just pray for just us to meditate on this. And God, I pray for the slides, that the kids would make good videos out of this, and that you would use this information for your glory, because it really does show how important you really are to us. We love you, and we thank you so much. Pray that you bless everybody's week. In Jesus' name.